Hello, my name is Austin Habish, the founder of Think Catholic, and you're listening to the Summa podcast, where we study St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae in a way simple and insightful for anyone to understand. The Summa podcast is brought to you by Think Catholic. Taking 2 questions of the Summa a day, we'll seek to summarize St. Thomas's responses, discovering the brilliance of Aquinas and his Catholic faith. This is day 69. So let's get started. We're covering today questions 16 and 17 of the Prima Secundae, that is, of use, which is an act of the will in regard to the means, and of the acts commanded by the will. The translation that I always use in these podcasts is the one generously provided to me by Ave Maria Press, the 5-volume set translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province, which you can now get at a discounted price from Ave Maria Press's site by typing in the code SUMMA10. And so here we go. Today we come to a close of a very windy, intricate couple of episodes describing the steps involved in human action as they bear on the intellect and will. Continuing that process today, we pass from the order of intention and human action, or the steps leading up to the act of choice of the means, to now the execution of those chosen means. Article 1, whether use is an act of the will. And although the term use is the closest English equivalent term to the Latin Aquinas is using here, I'm going to follow the Gilby translation of the Summa in translating Aquinas' Latin here into the English word application, because I think it is immensely helpful in understanding these articles. So rephrasing our article, we can ask, is application an act of the will? What is application as an act? It is defined by Aquinas as to refer that which is the object of application to the obtaining of something else. So it is the applying of the will to the execution of some means for the sake of the end. And why this act is found in the will, along with how it relates to the intellect as well as the other parts of the soul being put into action, St. Thomas gives the following explanation. It is evident that first and principally application belongs to the will as first mover, to the reason as directing, and to the other powers as executing the operation, which powers are compared to the will, which applies them to act, as the instruments are compared to the principal agent. Lastly, if it is helpful, St. Thomas gives us a short summary of the process of human action which immediately precedes this one, use or application, in these words from a later place in the Summa. He says, after counsel's decision, which is reason's judgment, the will chooses, and after choice, the reason commands that power which has to do what was chosen. And then last of all, someone's will begins to apply by executing the command of reason. The act of application as found in the will is the topic of this question, question 16, and the act of reason called command, which precedes it and was mentioned in this citation, will be the topic of the next question, question 17. Article 2, whether application is to be found in irrational animals. No. And St. Thomas's response to this article is the following. Animals, by means of their members, do something from natural instinct, not through knowing the relation of their members to these operations. Wherefore, properly speaking, they do not apply their members to action, nor do they use them. Article 3, whether application regards also the last end. In this article, Aquinas grapples with the different meanings of the term use, and how in some ways even the enjoyment of the end or goal can be called a kind of use of that goal. But when it comes to the act of the will as applied to the means, which is the sense in which we are using that term here, this act of application or use is always of the means and never of the end. As Aquinas writes, no one rightly uses God, but one enjoys him, but God alone is the last end. Therefore, we cannot use the last end. Article 4, whether application precedes choice. Application follows choice is the response from St. Thomas. Because I first choose the appropriate means to an end, then apply the will to the execution of those means. From here, that work is actually executed then by the relevant powers of the soul. In Aquinas' words, the motion of the will to the execution of the work precedes execution, but follows choice. And so, since use or application belongs to the very motion of the will, it stands between choice and execution. And for the sake of clarity, I've been fairly brief in these articles, hopefully making them easier to understand, but I would refer the listener to the text if they would like to learn more. And with that, we move on to question 17 of the acts commanded by the will. Article 1, whether command is an act of the reason or of the will. St. Thomas responds, command is an act of the reason, presupposing an act of the will, in virtue of which the reason, by its command, moves the power to the execution of the act. So command, an act of reason in the steps of human action, comes after choice, an act of the will, but before application, another act of the will. Command is an act of reason ordered to the application of the will regarding those means which have been already chosen. It moves the will, in Aquinas' words, by intimating and declaring. This is an act of reason, command. Article 2, whether command belongs to irrational animals. In the previous article, Aquinas will note that reason declares or commands something either in the manner of one declaring, this is what I ought to do, or in the imperative, such as in phrases like, do this. But in either example, command presupposes a kind of self-directing, which is beyond that of mere instinct. St. Thomas says, the impulse of the irrational animal arises from natural instinct, because as soon as they apprehend the fitting or the unfitting, their appetite is moved naturally to pursue or to avoid. Wherefore they are directed by another to act, and they themselves do not direct themselves to act. Article 3, whether application precedes command. Application, an act of the will come after command. And the reason for that is summed up in the following words by Aquinas. Application of that which is directed to the end, insofar as it is subject to the executive power, follows command, because application in the user is united to the act of the thing used. For one does not apply a stick before doing something with the stick, but command is not simultaneous with the act of the thing to which the command is given, for it naturally precedes its fulfillment. Consequently, it is evident that command precedes use or application. Article 4, whether command and the commanded act are one act or distinct. St. Thomas will say later on, command is nothing else than the act of the reason directing with a certain motion something to act. Then to help us understand how the act commanded and the command itself are one act, Aquinas presents to us the analogy of the unity of a human person, that in the one act of a human being existing is found both a formal cause of that act, which is the soul, the material cause of that act, which is the matter of his or her particular body, and this act is one, although it can be considered in its parts as two. In the same way, St. Thomas says, in human acts, the act of a lower power is in the position of matter in regard to the act of a higher power. For thus also the act of the first mover is as the form in regard to the act of its instrument. Hence it is evident that command and the commanded act are one human act, just as a whole is one, yet in its parts many. Article 5, whether the act of the will is commanded. Since the activity of the will is in the power of man, under man's cognizant control, its acts can be commanded. In a word from Aquinas, it is evident that the reason can direct the act of the will, for just as it can judge it to be good to will something, so it can direct by commanding man to will. From this it is evident that an act of the will can be commanded. Article 6, whether the act of the reason is commanded. And we command reason when we assent to some truth that is just not certainly apparent to us. But we cannot command reason in those truths known certainly by the light of natural reason, such as the principle of non-contradiction, the principle of sufficient reason, which we've covered in previous episodes. And we simply cannot sincerely think those principles to be otherwise. Those principles are certain to us, even if we don't know their technical names. But in regard to those things which we are unsure about, St. Thomas writes, some things which are apprehended do not convince the intellect to such an extent as not to leave it free to assent or dissent, or at least suspend its assent or dissent on account of some cause or other, and in such things assent or dissent is in our power and is subject to our command. Article 7, whether the act of the sensitive appetite is commanded. Can we command our passions? In one way we can, and in another way we cannot. Since sense appetite follows sense apprehension, for we don't desire the donut unless we first see it with our eyes or in the mind, in this way we can command our sensitive appetite by keeping our thoughts, imaginings, any externally sensed things that we think might trigger our passions away from us. But strictly speaking, we cannot command our passions because they follow immediately upon the apprehension of some sensible good. And this we know from experience by having to will or fight against our own passions. Article 8, whether the act of the vegetal soul is commanded. For more on Aquinas' notion of the soul in its broadest definition as well as defined in more everyday terms today, I'd recommend episodes 39 through 41 of this podcast. The question here is, can I command things like my digestion, my heart beating, the growth of my body? And not directly, although we do have some influence over some of these processes of our body insofar as our passions or our actions can affect our heart rate or affect the nutritive, generative faculties of our body. But in general, and in response to this article, St. Gregory of Nyssa says, the nutritive and generative power is one over which the reason has no control. Article 9, whether the acts of the external members are commanded. Are the movements of our arms and legs under the control of our command? And we see very clearly that this is the case. St. Thomas will quote St. Augustine to this effect, who says, the mind commands a movement of the hand, and so ready is the hand to obey that scarcely can one discern obedience from command. And that is all for our final episode on this progression of human action. Our next episode will kick off the discussion on good and evil in human action. But that is all for questions 16 and 17 of the Prima Secundae, that is of use, which is an act of the will in regard to the means, and of the acts commanded by the will. My name is Austin Habish with Think Catholic, and I cannot wait to see you tomorrow.